Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're just at the start of our great book on the great debate, Does God Exist? And this is the great debate that Dr. Greg Stein and Dr. Greg Bahnsen and Dr. Gordon Stein had back in the 80s that kind of kicked off the presuppositional apologetic world tour. And it's probably one of the most cited one that we go back to because of kind of how in the weeds it gets, but in a good way. And Dr. Bahnsen really shines through here of really pressing for both sides to present kind of justification for beliefs. And so what we've done so far is just taken the opening statement for both Dr. Bahnsen and Dr. Stein. And this debate might seem a little bit different in form than what you're used to, especially for those who might be following, the blood sport version of debates online these days, where it just is maybe an opening statement and then followed by back and forth. This one gets into a Q&A immediately, and then that's one of the things that we're going to be covering for this episode. And then it will go back into more argumentation and more Q&As and some more back and forth. I'm not quite sure of the reason for this. It doesn't seem like that's been the debate format for much of history, but it seems like a valid form. Maybe it's to help clarify and concede. I've seen Dr. James White argue with more back and forth and more rebuttals before, so having a different format is not outside the norm. It's just probably more outside the norm than what we're used to.
Right. So folks should be aware that in this section of the book, both debaters, right, Bahnsen and Stein, asked each other 5 questions, right? Mm-hmm. They have 5 questions that they ask. And so Bahnsen asked 5 questions of Stein, and then Stein asked 5 questions of Bahnsen. Now, they go a little further than just, asking and answering the questions, because they get into a few toughs there with regard to the various answers. But basically, that's all this section of the book is doing. Each one gets 5 questions that they answer the other. And apparently, you get the feeling maybe they're trying to set up something for later on, right? Yeah. I think Stein says, well, later we're going to deal with that. Right. But, it's hard to understand why they would put this kind of thing, in as part of the debate. But maybe it's for clarification and that sort of thing, as you suggested.
So we definitely suggest picking up the book because the audio versions that are out there, have gotten better due to the great computer surge since the 1980s. That's still not perfect, and you can kind of have more time with the argumentations as you're reading it and seeing the flow of different argumentations or the stoppage of flow, depending on who's doing the argumentation there. So as we read this one, there's going to be kind of Q&A back and forth. And again, we suggest picking up the book. We don't cover absolutely everything in the book, and some of this back and forth will be clear to you as we kind of go forth and comment on it from there. All right, so Dr. Bahnsen has the first cross-examination, and he starts out with this first question of Dr. Stein. Do you have any sources that you can give us very briefly that define atheism as one who finds the theistic proofs inadequate rather than one who denies the existence of God? And so again, this harkens back to a few episodes ago where Dr. Stein has given his definition of atheism. Again, probably one that we're more accustomed to these days of atheism not presenting any side, any proof. Just I lack a belief in God, so as not to need to present any evidence for their side or a burden of proof. And so that's what Dr. Bahnsen is doing here with asking his first question. Dr. Stein, of course, replies, yes, sir. George Smith's book, which you will find for sale at the back of the room upstairs later, called Atheism, A Case Against God. Then
I wonder if he got anything from it.
Yeah, the Amazon finder's fee is still there. Yeah. And then Dr. Stein also suggests Charles Bradlaugh, who I will give to you right now. 100 years ago, Charles Bradlaugh made the comment in his plea for atheism. So Dr. Stein is saying this is not a novel idea. In fact, it's at least 100 years old. So maybe you should have been prepared for this definition, Dr. Bahnsen.
Yeah. So notice that the idea here is the atheist is he doesn't have to give any positive argument for his position. All he has to do is attempt to defeat the theist arguments for God, and then he believes he's done his job. Right? If I can defeat all the arguments for God, then the other alternative is atheism. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where he's coming from. So kind of interesting. He makes himself, have a less than it's a position that's really easy to defend, because I'm just attempting to defeat your position. I don't have to, there's no burden of proof on his side is the idea here. Right. So All right, the second question that Dr. Bahnsen asked, he says, Dr. Stein, did you hear Dr. Bahnsen, so he refers to himself here, use the following argument? The Bible says that God exists, and the Bible is the inspired word of God. Therefore, what it says must be true. Therefore, God exists. So, right, he asked Stein, hey, did you hear me say that? What was my argument? And of course, Stein says, well, you didn't use that. You didn't use that, he says. You just assumed that was so because you were quoting from the Bible as if it proves the existence. And then Bahnsen stops him and says, I didn't ask you what I assumed. I asked you if I use that argument. Whoa, right? And so we're getting a little, huffy here. And we'll see this, by the way, from both sides. They both get into it here. And then Stein says, no, you did not use that argument, but you used the results of that argument. So, he's trying to get his in there.
Right.
So Stein says, basically he's suggesting here that, Bahnsen here is suggesting that Stein was using a straw man argument to attack him. Right, by this viciously circular argument. And Bahnsen wants to be clear, he didn't use that argument. That was not his argument. Right. So if Stein is trying to attack that argument, he's attacking a straw man.
Right. So just for the atheist in this YouTube comment, here's what I'm going to refer to you in this video to show all the other times that you've misconstrued the previous episodes as well. All right, how about for the question 3? Dr. Bahnsen asked Dr. Stein, you mentioned 11 basic proofs for the existence of God. Did you mention the transcendental proof for the existence of God? Of course, this is the proof that Dr. Bahnsen is using, he's wanting to stick with. Tony and I were discussing beforehand that we're not sure if Dr. Bahnsen or Dr. Stein were in talks about what they would talk about to kind of focus the debate. I'm assuming in some way there was some discussion, but maybe that's more difficult before the advent of email, which I think helps alleviate a lot of these. So I'm not sure if Dr. Stein here knew who Dr. Bahnsen was or what his argument might be. And so that might fit into, I guess, the good faith nature of this portion of the debate. So he's asking, did you mention out of all your proofs, did you mention the transcendental proof for the existence of God? Which again, we go back to Kant to say, like, this isn't a novel idea. This is something rooted in not just Christian apologetics, but in philosophy as a whole. Dr. Stein replies that, no, I didn't mention it by name. I think it is not a proof. I would not call it a proof. And then Dr. Bahnsen says, well, I don't have time to rebut that point. In other words, you didn't deal with that particular one. So Dr. Stein doesn't believe that the transcendental proof is a proof. If he would consider a proof, he probably would have dealt with it, is his implication. And Dr. Bahnsen will set the tee up for that one.
Right. And then in the midst of this then, and for our folks who are reading along with us, Joshua Pillows is the one that put this particular book together based on this debate. And he does comments throughout the various chapters here. And so one of the comments that he makes after this kind of exchange, he says, and this is a comment by Joshua Pillows, who's the editor of the book. He says, the only intellectual benefit to Dr. Stein mentioning every other argument for God's existing under the sun, except for the one that he was supposed to address, is that it gave us plenty of material for illustrating the failure of the traditional Christian arguments for God and the lethal outcome of attempting to do apologetics in a neutral fashion, which is kind of an interesting. So notice Pillow is suggesting here that, these traditional arguments for the existence of God, he's implying he doesn't agree with them. Bahnsen is going to say later he doesn't agree that those arguments work. And so, he's bringing this out. And so he's suggesting that these traditional arguments fail. And so it's helpful that Stein brought these out so that we can see the failure of these traditional arguments, right? So there you go.
And not all presuppositionalists would point to this, but we would probably all be in the same agreement that these argumentations could be used, but probably later down the path than what we would want to cover, which would be presuppositional, transcendental arguments, worldview ideas, and justification of holding to things like the preconditions of intelligibility and the like.
Yeah, there are assumptions that the atheist has that they have no right to hold, as we'll see even in this discussion, like the grounding of the laws of logic in what? Nothing, in material existence.
Right.
And so the presuppositionalist wants to go one step back further than these traditional arguments. These traditional arguments give the atheist too much ground. right? They give him too much. And so the presupposition says, and before we get there, what about the whole notion of the laws of logic? How do you defend those? Where did they come from? How are you using those, right?
Mhm.
You're using those circularly. You're using the laws of logic to defend the laws of logic. Why are you able to do that? You calling me circular arguments, your arguments are circular as well, right? So the presuppositionalist doesn't want to give the atheist that much room. In fact, Bahnsen's going to say that Stein steals basically from his worldview in order to make his argument. Right.
Right. All right. The next question that Dr. Bahnsen asks is, are all factual questions answered in the very same way? And this harkens back to the very funny portion where he talks about crackers not mattering in the pantry. And,
Right.
and so that's what he wants to clarify here is, are all the factual questions answered in the very same way? And Dr. Stein admits that no, they're not. They are answered by the use of certain methods, though, that are the same: reason, logic, and presenting evidence and facts. So those are the kind of three tools in his tool belt that he says he's able to use. So this might be a mischaracterization by Dr. Bahnsen on the fact that Dr. Stein wants to use just the presenting of evidence and facts. But we'll see if Dr. Bahnsen concedes that point.
Okay, and then the last question that Bahnsen gives, and this, he spent some time on. In fact, a lot of the debate is going to be, and this is the issue that I just brought out with regard to logic and that sort of thing. A lot of the debate is going to be taken up on the notion of the basis for logic, right? And so Bahnsen says, I heard you mention logical binds and logical self-contradictions in your speech. Did you say that? And he says, yes, I did. I use that phrase, yes. He says, do you believe that there are laws of logic then? And Stein, absolutely. And Bahnsen says then, are they universal? And of course, Stein says they are agreed upon by human beings. They aren't laws that exist out in nature. All right. So it's not something that's just out there in nature. They're agreed upon by human beings, right? And so Bahnsen says, so are they simply conventions then? And Stein, they are conventions, but they are conventions that are self-verifying. Are they material in nature? And of course, he says, how could a law be material? And of course, now Bahnsen gets a zing in, right? That's the question I'm going to ask you. And Stein says, I would say no. All right. So you see here, he's going to set him up because he's going to use now this whole notion of the laws of logic, and he's going to use that as a hammer here to nail Stein over and over again with regard to this. And
right.
So we'll see that, especially as we go further.
Right. So, are laws, are there laws of logic? So you can kind of think this as, is there a law to only drive 55 on the highway? Dr. Stein would say yes. And then the question is, well, is it universal? Do you have to drive 55 everywhere, and including, Jupiter and Alpha Centauri? And so there we're wanting to define between two different types of laws. This one's by human beings, human conventions, like, well, humans pass laws and you should obey them because they're enforceable by violence or fine or fee, but they're not, baked in, like jumping off the earth will take you back. It's the law of gravity is different than the law of driving on the highway, right? And so is it just a matter of this convention of human beings kind of agreeing to it, or is it in the universe somewhere? And if you're a materialist, then you have to materialize them in some way. Even if they're invisible, you have to be able to titrate it or break it down into its various parts or what have you in that one. And so here, Dr. Bahnsen's got him almost on the back foot, it seems like, saying, it seems like Stein is a strict materialist here. And he's saying, well, there are things that happen within nature that aren't material. And so it's like, well, all right, we're gonna have to clarify that a little bit more here. All right, so this starts off then with the next Q&A portion, which is then Dr. Stein pivoting to the questioner and Dr. Bahnsen being the answerer. I think that's the correct titles there.
Yeah. So Stein's going to ask his 5 questions of Bahnsen here, right? Bahnsen had his turn, and now it's Stein's turn.
Stein asked Dr. Bahnsen, would you call God material or immaterial? Immaterial. What is something that's immaterial? Something not extended in space. Can you give me an example of anything other than God that's immaterial? And here's the lead off and the pitch. Crack, the laws of logic are things that are not material as well. And so this is trying to, Dr. Stein is trying to capture Bahnsen into automatically kind of a special pleading or wherever he was going with this. But Dr. Bahnsen is going to give him an example of something that Dr. Stein believes is immaterial, and then puts him in the same camp as Dr. Bahnsen with believing that something exists that is immaterial.
Right. And of course, this is a huge zinger, right, in this debate. And Joshua Pillows here makes the comment, the audience erupted with laughter and applause for this gotcha moment by Bahnsen, right?
And promulgated by men.
Are they material in nature?
How can a law be material?
That's the question I'm going to ask you.
I would say no. Dr. Bahnsen, would you call God material or immaterial?
Immaterial.
What is something that's immaterial?
Something not extended in space.
Can you give me an example of anything other than God that's immaterial?
Laws of logic.
Can I ask that you hold that down, please?
In other words, you believe he's trying to force Bahnsen into suggesting that there, whether or not there's material, immaterial things. Give me an example of an immaterial thing outside of God.
Right.
And of course, Bahnsen says the laws of logic. Oops, right? So the audience break out, right? And the original transcript of the debate has the moderator saying that I'm going to have to ask the audience to hold it down, please hold it down, and that sort of thing, because it was a really gotcha moment in the debate.
Right, especially if on the audio, these aren't the super nice microphones we have today that everyone has one, especially post-COVID, where we all have podcasts now. These were very primitive microphones for the time, and it's picking up the ruckus behavior of the audience, which shouldn't be happening. It's like going to the symphony and jeering at someone who is off by a key. Yeah. All right. Well, that's just the start of question one. So question two then for Dr. Stein is your God omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent? He is. You don't find that a contradiction at all? I do not. Okay, well, we'll show you that a little later, Dr. Stein's response is. So again, here is Dr. Stein, again, now using his Q&A to clarify for Dr. Bahnsen, but also to set up his ball on the tee here. So we'll see what he means by all these things, the omnis and the all-powerfulness.
Yeah, that's right. And the omnis. His third then question here, Dr. Stein says, if your arguments in favor of the existence of God are shown to be incorrect, will you relinquish your belief in God? And if my arguments are disproven, Bahnsen asks, yes. Will I relinquish my belief in God? If there are no arguments for the existence of God, I wouldn't believe in God. That's what Bahnsen, how he answers that.
And so Joshua Pillows comes in and clarifies here, or I guess, I think he does a pretty decent job of not being so much an apologist for Dr. Bahnsen, but here he says that this statement by Bahnsen can be seen as quite problematic, conflicting with his other beliefs. The Reformed perspective on man's knowledge of God is shown in his revelation inherent in us and everywhere about us. Knowledge of God is revelationally dependent, not argument dependent.
So that's an interesting distinction there, right? Mm-hmm. That we know God by his revelation of himself to us, not by various arguments that can be made, right? And so that is I think that's a helpful distinction here. He's, of course, referring back to Romans 1, where it says that we all know God, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's revelationally dependent, the knowledge of God, not argument dependent, which is kind of interesting here.
But Pills goes on to say that Bahnsen gives clarification to this remark shortly, elucidating his original response. Rationally speaking, if there is no basis for belief in the existence of God, transcendentally, I would relinquish that belief.
Right. So what's going to happen next now is Bahnsen's going to clear up, right, this particular problematic statement that Pillow points out. And he's going to make the basis of his belief in God, not on arguments, but on revelation, right? Yeah. And we see that as we go to question 4. Yeah. Scientist, is God good? Bahnsen, yes, he is. How do you know that? He saved me. He created me. He made the world. He made it good. He sent his son into the world to die for my sins. If you mean is God good in such a way, or can I give you evidence that you would accept? That would depend on what your presuppositions are, right? So that's kind of an interesting. So I misspoke there. In the third question and answer, Bahnsen, as you indicated there, Patrick, he does come back and say, rationally speaking, if there is no basis for belief in the existence of God, notice he doesn't say argument. He says basis right? So rationally speaking, if there's no basis for the belief in God, I would relinquish that belief. And so he eventually cleans that up as Joshua Pillow says. Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to, I was too far ahead there.
Yeah.
All right. So then this fourth question, is he good? And of course, Bahnsen gives all kinds of reasons why he believes that God is good, but he also he suggests that those reasons won't, make any muster with Stein, because Stein has different presuppositions.
Right. And this too goes into kind of the nature of evidence, right? So, if we're talking about a person robbing the bank, and you don't believe somebody robbed the bank, but you could say, well, here's video evidence showing a group of people with ski masks on. Well, you could say, well, it's in the middle of December, and that's common in these parts. That doesn't point to a robbery. Well, it might not get you to the actual robbery, but it is evidence that is presented for the case. Now, it could be not convincing evidence, but evidence presented for the case is still evidence. You'd have to say something like it's not a joinder to the evidence. Like if I said a flock of birds flew overhead, the connection to the bank robbery might not be clear. But
right.
As far as evidence goes, it is some form of evidence. So again, Bahnsen clarifying here of saying like, well, would you accept it, is a different type of question than what you're asking. It's this incredulity part of the debate that gets lost. It's what you're bringing up is incoherent. That's what I've been hearing for the past week on YouTube comments. It's like, well, it's not incoherent. It's just you don't buy it. Like, you don't like the argument. That's a different thing than I'm saying the rabid squirrel does calculus. That might be more incoherent, but it's not. The
round circle is in the cabinet.
Right.
What? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the square circle. There you go. The square circle is in the cabinet. Now that's incoherent. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, that's an interesting point with regard to evidence, and with regard to what Bahnsen's point here is. Obviously, what evidence is, we usually think of evidence as more than just facts, right? Evidence has to do with what makes my particular position more probable or more believable, right? So what can be evidence depends on, my position and how I see it and that sort of thing. So if I'm looking at a rock, somebody could say, well, that's evidence that, I don't know, it's of evolution. Right? Because, or of an old earth, let's say. That's evidence of an old earth. What do you mean? Well, it's a rock. Rocks, they take, a long time to form, blah, blah, blah. No, that's evidence of a young earth, right? How? Well, because, a flood pushed the rock around. So it's the same facts. How you view the facts is based on your presuppositions. And so you have to go back, Bahnsen is going to eventually say, to look at the coherence of your worldview, your presuppositions, even in order to determine what fact is evidence, right? And so that's what he's getting at here.
Right. And so Dr. Stein here says, no, I'm asking, if God says something, anything, is it right because anything God does is good because God is good, or does it become good just because God said it?
Yeah, so I think here Stein, I think we all understand where Stein is going with this, but he really messes up this argument, right? He stumbles over it here, and maybe he was trying to get to it too fast. But anyway.
And then Joshua Pillows makes the comment here, Stein is referring to what's known as the Euthyro dilemma, which we've covered on the show as well. If you just type in Euthyro dilemma, we've covered it in a couple books, in fact. But Dr. Bahnsen says, I understand the problem, though it's roughly stated. What God says to be good is good because it reflects his own character. God is good and is the standard of goodness. That's one of the presuppositions of the Christian worldview.
Okay. And so notice the Euthyro dilemma sees the good coming out of God's will, his commands, and that sort of thing. And of course, the Christian response is, no, it's not arbitrarily whatever God says. It's based on who God is, an unchanging, all good God. And so it's based on his character, not his will or his just whimsically whatever he said at the time, right? That's the notion here that Bahnsen is getting at. All right, and then the last question that Stein gets here of his 5 questions to Bahnsen, he says, when we talk about immaterial things, are you also saying there's such a thing as ghost or the soul, which are other examples of immaterial things? Would you call them immaterial? And he says, well, I would say man is a living soul and has an immaterial aspect of his being, yes. this. And then Stein says, well, how would you prove this? All right. And so now Bahnsen is, he's getting a little irritated because he believes that Stein is kind of, this is a debate about the existence of God, not, So he says, this has to do with the existence of God now, right? Stein says, well, it has to do with the existence of immaterial things. Well, if there's an immaterial being, God, and if the Bible is his word, then I would say that his revealing the nature of man in the Bible is sufficient proof. So there it is, right? He's right back to trying to get back to the debate subject, right?
Yeah. For debates, this is the kitchen sink move, which tends to happen a little bit either in the rebuttal period or sometimes in the Q&A factor. Is you throw 6 different things into there and you give your opponent the 1 minute that they're supposed to kind of make clarification or answering the question, and you say, well, look, he didn't answer this, and so this seems to be wanting to move the debate outside the scope of this almost general question of does God exist, and bring it out into, well, now you also have to prove the soul exists, and there we can get into topics of near-death experiences or the nature of the mind or the existence thereof, and it just heaps more onto the categories than what you're intending to. And so here, Dr. Stein, whether you want to give him the benefit of the doubt or not, at least links it up to immaterial things that got the big reaction from the audience as well.
Yeah. Good.
All right, so that's it for the back and forth Q&A for this one. There will be more to come. Next, we're going to go on to Dr. Bahnsen's rebuttal next week. And so if we've captivated you yet from the great debate here, Joshua Pill's book is available for pickup at American Vision. There's a link in anywhere we post this. There's a link for it. And so you can pick it up and join us in reading next time and see what Dr. Bahnsen has to make from what's been going on in the debate so far. So as always, we say thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.